Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with a Scientist. I am Leah from Headwaters, and we've got Lacey Hankin here joining us. Hi, Lacey.
Hi.
So, Lacey is a PhD candidate from the Bisbing Forest Ecology Lab at the University of Nevada, Reno. And we're so excited to have her talking today. She got her master's in Systems Ecology at the University of Montana, and she has a bachelor's from Williams College in biology and history. And she, in her research, is interested in patterns of seedling establishment. And she looks at seedling traits and performance in high elevation Great Basin forests. So today, she's going to talk to us a little bit about the future of high elevation pine forests. And we are really excited to hear what she has to say. So I am going to turn it over to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. All right. Just get this started here. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. As was already mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Nevada, Reno. Today, I want to share with you some of my research on high elevation pine forests just in this region, and hopefully highlight why we should continue to care and study our forested landscapes. And I wanted to start with what it means to be an ecologist. So ecology is the study of how an organism interacts with other organisms and with their surrounding environment. So no organism exists in isolation. They exist in communities where they interact with other living things, as well as being influenced by their environmental conditions. And I work kind of at the intersection of forest ecology and disturbance ecology, where I study the effects of things like fire, beetle outbreaks, or climate change on trees. So why should we study forests? Well, forests cover a huge portion of the Earth's surface, but they're rapidly declining in many regions due to climate change or deforestation. And this loss of forests around the world has a lot of consequences for both ecological and anthropogenic systems. And that's because trees provide a lot of ecosystem services, which are benefits derived from the environment and from healthy ecosystems. For example, we can live on Earth because trees produce oxygen during photosynthesis. So that makes it able for us to kind of enjoy the conditions that allow living things to persist on Earth. Forests also provide abundant wildlife habitat. They cycle key elements such as carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, and they filter harmful pollutants before they enter our waterways. They also stabilize soils, regulate water, and provide timber and recreational resources. And high elevation forests in particular, which are the ones that I study, are incredibly important because they exist in these really harsh environments where other plants have difficulty growing. And they're isolated because they're on the tops of these mountain ranges. So they provide important habitat, they stabilize the steep rocky terrain, and they regulate snowpack, which is the primary water source to most kind of mountainous systems in the West. Because these environments are so harsh, they're extremely slow growing and long-lived tree species. One of the species I work on, bristlecone pine, is the oldest individual is about 5,000 years old. So these trees have lived through natural climatic fluctuations in the past. But we're now in this period of unprecedented climate change, which has raised concerns about the future of these forests. And climate change is one of the primary threats to our forested systems around the world. For example, this figure is showing future climate in California and Nevada for two of the most likely scenarios, a warm dry scenario on the left and a warm wet scenario on the right. So we have precipitation on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. And these figures are essentially showing zones of climate space and what will happen to those zones in the future. So the kind of blue, cooler colors are areas of climate space that will disappear or significantly decline in the future. And the warmer colors are areas of climate space that will increase in the future. And it's worth noting that that dark red space are completely novel climates that are expected before the end of the century. So high elevation forests exist in these dark blue areas that you see in the upper left of these figures. And those are the ones that are predicted to disappear in the near future. With climate change also comes more frequent and more severe drought, which has already caused widespread forest mortality. Drought also weakens trees so that they can't defend themselves as well against other stressors like beetles or disease. Warming has also shifted population dynamics and extent of the native mountain pine beetle. And while small outbreaks are normal, warming has allowed the beetles to move up higher in elevations into forests that did not historically experience beetle attack. Beetle populations are also having greater winter survival, as well as higher reproduction due to warming. And this has led to one of the largest mortality events across California and Nevada in recent decades. For the species I work on in particular, the non-native pathogen that causes white pine blister rust is another significant threat, particularly in the Rocky Mountains. And this disease essentially constricts the stems, which you can see those bright orange cankers that form on the stem, so that the tree can't perform its usual water and nutrient transportation, which is essential for survival. Finally, because these are dry, high elevation environments that have pretty sparse vegetation, fire is not actually a dominant force in these systems. However, parts of the region are wetter and more productive, and these areas are facing potential changes in fire activity. So together, all of these threats and unknowns, they interact to raise concerns over forest persistence. So this is really what my research is focused on. How might we expect these forests to change or not change in the future? And in response to changes in climate or different pressures from disturbance agents, trees can respond in different ways depending on their life strategy, which might include how fast they mature or reproduce, or how long they live. Forests might migrate to more suitable conditions, for example, move up in elevation to track more suitable temperature and moisture. They might adapt, which means that over many generations, there are genetic changes that allow for them to adjust their strategies to new conditions. Or they might be able to adjust to new conditions rapidly within a tree's lifetime. And this is called phenotypic plasticity. Plasticity is likely to be the most important response for these very long-lived tree species because they live for thousands of years. So they have to endure a lot of different climate conditions and changes during their lifetime. I address these kind of overarching questions of what the future looks like for these forests by focusing on forest regeneration, which is when new trees, called seedlings, establish and grow. And regeneration is the key ingredient for forest persistence because as older trees die or a fire or beetle outbreak occurs, we need to have new trees replacing them. And seedlings are really sensitive to harsh conditions, so it's critical to understand what conditions promote seedling survival because this is a key bottleneck for forest recovery. Some of the more specific questions I ask to better understand forest dynamics are how are high elevation forests recovering following disturbance, and does the disturbance type matter? What climate conditions promote forest regeneration, and how might these forests respond to future environmental conditions? There are two primary methods that I use to address these questions, both observational studies and experimental studies. Observational studies are studies that observe the effect of some variable of interest without interfering with the system. So you're kind of simply looking at natural variability and patterns, often in a field setting. Experimental studies actually manipulate the organisms in some way. So they often randomly assign different treatments or in my case, I'm kind of transplanting different populations to observe the effects of those actions. And I'll briefly go about each of these types of studies and share some broad results. So right now, my work focuses on the 3 dominant high elevation species of the Great Basin and Eastern California, and these are limber pine, bristlecone pine, and whitebark pine. And these species can tolerate the harsh environment of the upper tree line and grow for thousands of years. They're primarily bird dispersed, so they have these really large, nutritious seeds that attract birds. The birds collect seeds from these cones and then store them in different places around the landscape in caches in the ground. So these caches provide a food source for the birds throughout the year, but the birds also forget quite a few of the caches, and those are where new trees can establish. So for my observational studies, I sample field plots looking at different patterns of regeneration across different disturbance types. And my plots are kind of distributed across Eastern California and Nevada in the mountain ranges that you see in the map on the right. So at each of the field plots, we characterize things like regeneration density, understory competition, topography and soils, disturbance characteristics, and mature tree density, because all of these factors are likely to interact to drive natural regeneration. And we found that regeneration is highly variable across disturbances and species. In the figure on the right, you can see how variable regeneration is across disturbances and species shown in different colors. So you can see regeneration density, which is the number of trees in a given area on the y-axis, and disturbance type on the x-axis. So we see beetles, fire, and no disturbance. And this type of figure shows box plots, which show essentially the median and the range of regeneration for all the sites that make up that specific category, so the disturbance species combination. And you can see that whitebark pine in the purple has the highest regeneration, followed by limber pine in pink and bristlecone pine in orange. But you can see that there's a huge range of regeneration and potentially an effect of disturbance, but it's hard to tell just based on these figures. So we use statistical models to better tease apart what factors are important for driving this variation. And these models reveal that each species responds differently to climate conditions, and that their sensitivity to climate depends on whether disturbance has recently occurred. So for example, whitebark pine was highest in wetter and cooler conditions, while limber pine was the most tolerant of water stress. But bristlecone pine also showed potential benefits of warmer temperatures. But with warming comes increasing water stress. So there's kind of this tricky balance for seedlings to be able to grow and survive during warmer and drier summers. And because each species responds differently, we might expect to see some compositional shifts in the future away from species that prefer wetter and cooler conditions. So to better understand what's actually driving seedling survival in different environments, we then use experiments to test how different species and populations respond to being planted in different environments. So these experiments help us assess the capacity of different populations to respond to change. And you can just see in these photos, this is kind of what our experiments look like. So it's kind of different from what you kind of expect as a typical lab experiment. These are done mostly in the field to kind of get that natural variability in the environment. And so these experiments are called common gardens, where different populations are grown together in a common environment. We consider a population kind of a geographically distinct group of trees. And so this type of experiment allows us to compare how potentially genetically distinct groups of individuals respond to the same climate conditions, and how they might change when they're moved to different conditions that might simulate expected climate change. So we actually carry out a specific type of common gardens called reciprocal transplant experiments. And this is where you take seeds from different mountain ranges or populations and then plant all of these different populations in each of the other locations where those seeds were collected. And then you see how they grow and survive in conditions that are different from their local environment. So for example, a more southern population from warmer and drier conditions might possess strategies that are advantageous in the future. And these are the conditions we might expect by the end of the century. So these strategies could potentially be advantageous in more northern populations that are expected to experience the same warming and drying. So we might consider using those more southern seed sources to do replanting in the more northern areas to assist with that process of adaptation and adjustment to a changing climate. And you can see that there are kind of two types of common gardens that we use in these photos. The top is similar to what I showed you in the last slide, which are our reciprocal transplant common gardens in the field. And then we also pair these experiments with a greenhouse common garden, where we can control the climate conditions and have as much of a kind of constant environment as we possibly can. So in each garden, we measure characteristics of the seedlings that might be important for growth and survival. For example, seed size and mass determines how many resources the seedling has when they're just starting out. And how a seedling allocates its mass is really important for processes like photosynthesis or nutrient acquisition. And so investment in roots is a kind of a typical strategy in water stress environments, so they can better access very limited water and nutrients with more root mass. Needle and root architecture just are similarly important for these processes of gas exchange and nutrient acquisition. And then the timing of different events can also be important for seedling survival. So if anyone has a garden at home, you know that you don't want to plant certain vegetables like tomatoes too early, or else they might die from the frost. So just like those vegetables, seedlings do not want to begin growing too early in the spring, or else they might get damaged or killed by cold temperatures. But because this growing season is so short at high elevations, they also want enough time to grow. And because they rely on snowpack, they're also they also have to balance the availability of water, because as soon as snow melts, there's no more water throughout the growing season. In the fall, seedlings also have to decide when to stop growing and harden to be able to survive the winter. So the balance of these events are really important for early seedling survival. And traits like these likely vary among populations because they grow in different environments, different soil conditions, different temperature and moisture conditions. Therefore, we can directly compare them when they're all grown together in the same place. And if they adjust those traits when they're moved to a different environment, this would indicate plasticity, which I mentioned before as a potentially really important response for these tree species. And together, these studies can help us better understand how forests will recover to disturbance and persist in the future. So we can identify conditions that lead to low natural regeneration. So these areas might be targets for managers to come in after that disturbance for more active planting efforts. With experiments, we can also better understand potential thresholds for seedling survival and identify populations or species that might be better suited for the future. So populations that have traits or characteristics that allow them to tolerate water stress and warmer temperatures. And these populations should be the ones that are used as seed sources for future planting efforts. To wrap up, I just want to briefly thank all the folks at the University of Nevada, Reno, who have supported this project, both in terms of funding as well as mentorship, as well as funding from the California Native Plant Society and the U.S. Forest Service. And thank you so much for having me speak to you all today. I'm happy to take any questions, or please feel free to reach out later. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about high elevation forests.
Thank you, Lacey. That was great.
Thank you.
It was totally fascinating to hear about what you're doing with reforestation. And I'm wondering, you talked a lot about kind of your lab work, which really for you is field work. Are some of these reforestation efforts actually happening out there up in the high elevation forests currently?
So you're right that it's not as much of a management priority in these high elevation forests for this region yet, because we haven't really had cause for concern. But the Rocky Mountains are kind of management pioneers for these forests. They've experienced a lot of mortality from the threats that I mentioned. So they are doing more active planting, doing genetic screening for more resistance to these different biotic stressors. So it'll be interesting to see if that kind of trickles west to this region as we're seeing increased mortality.
That's fascinating. And yeah, to follow up on that, I'm wondering, I'm sure some viewers from home are thinking that they love the forest and they love to be in the forest. And are there any ways that people from home can volunteer with a local organization or help with efforts that you might recommend?
That's a great question. There are certainly kind of just educational opportunities through things like the California Native Plant Society to get out into these environments, go for a hike with an expert, learn more about them. I think for these systems in particular, that's probably kind of the first step, just, gaining an appreciation and learning about them. But I'm happy to follow up with some more specifics. I don't have anything else on the top of my head.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to go to a couple audience questions. The first one is, will some species of animals that only live at the highest elevations be able to respond and adapt to the change where the forests are?
Sure. So that's a great question. Hopefully I'll be able to answer it a little bit, although I don't focus on the animal populations.
Right.
But birds play a huge role in these forests. As I mentioned, they are responsible for the seed dispersal of most of these species. So there's definitely a lot of concern about how these bird species will respond to climate. They have shown to have some flexibility in the species that they use as a food source. So there has been some use in lower elevation populations of trees. So far it seems like they're going to be able to adjust to maybe compositional shifts in vegetation if it continues to be tree cover. There's certainly a possibility that there's more of a shrub-dominated state that could persist in some of these systems in the future.
Interesting. It sounds like we have a lot of change coming.
Yeah.
Here's another great question coming up here. So you talked a little bit about plasticity or building resiliency to different climate impacts. So someone is wondering, how long does it really take for those southern populations you mentioned to build a resiliency? And then once that happens, are they still exactly the same species as the northern variety of the counterparts?
Yeah, they definitely, they do have fairly high genetic differentiation between these different populations. but they are still considered the same species, even though they might exhibit different characteristics. So far we haven't seen evidence of kind of enough difference to consider different species. There's even some hybridization between some of these high elevation species as well. So they're really closely related. And in terms of the first part of the question, it's taken a very long time, I'm sure. I don't actually know the answer to that question, but they live, even the younger individuals are just over 1,000 years old. So it's really kind of slow change that's happening. So really the kind of their strategy for being able to have resilience to different climates is having either plasticity, which I mentioned, or having a really wide tolerance so that it doesn't really matter what they experience throughout their lifetime. Yeah.
Interesting. So which of the species that you study would you say has the most broad tolerance?
Limber pine is known to have the widest tolerance, which is also seen just in its distribution. It has the widest distribution from Southern California, Arizona, all the way up to Canada. So you can see that it can exist in a really wide range of environments.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I think we're going to wrap up pretty soon here, but I do have one last question, and this goes kind of back to your education and how you got to where you are today. So we may have some young scientists watching who have an interest in the forest and would one day like to have a career like yours. What would you recommend as far as the steps for them to take, where they should look for education, and how can they get to where you're at?
Sure, definitely. Well, I think the first step is just, getting out in the forest and kind of fostering that curiosity and kind of deciding what really piques your interest and what are you most interested in those forest systems, because there's a lot of different questions that you can address in the forest. And then for more specifically, if you want to pursue undergraduate research or graduate research, I think something that I've learned is to not be afraid to reach out to people, find a really good mentor. You can even, go on a website, find an email and reach out with questions. And people are generally, from students all the way up to, long-term professors are really happy to answer questions, help you find opportunities to do research or join a lab. And so kind of as an introvert, that was a really useful kind of idea that I've gained over my experience.
That's great. It sounds like using the resources available is really key.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we do post the archives of these talks, so if you are watching the archive and you have questions, you can always post them in the comments, and we'll reach out to Lacey and get you an answer. And we'll try to find some more resources for if you want to try to take care of your local forest. And otherwise, I want to thank you so much, Lacey Hankin, for joining us today and for telling us all about your amazing research.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm happy to follow up with anyone who's interested.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to say goodbye, but thank you and have a good day.
You too. Take care.